This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 9. Stephen Gardiner. The figure of Stephen Gardiner is not among the very great figures of the English Reformation, or at any rate not quite in the first flight. On this account, it has been in great part neglected, and quite unduly neglected, because although he did not mold events nor decide the general course of the movement, there is one reason for which all those who desire to understand the great disaster should make themselves well acquainted with this man. This reason is that he was the typical Englishman of the day. If you follow the fortunes of Stephen Gardiner's soul, the fluctuation of his opinion, his utter devotion to national feeling, his original error on this account, his gradual awakening to the peril in which religion lay, his wild career, especially on its spiritual internal side, then you understand the England of the time. Henry, the king, impulsive and very vain, was certainly not a typical Englishman. Even Mary Tudor, with her half-Spanish blood and her isolated mind, could not be called typical of the country. Cranmer was not, for he was not too much of an artist and much too much of a time-server and a coward to be typical of an ordinary, healthy, normal citizen of any time or place. Elizabeth was still less typical of England, for both by her talents and by her diseases of body and soul she was an abnormality. But Gardiner is the true Englishman of the time in body and mind and everything else, and that is his importance. Understanding him, you understand the English Reformation, or rather, you understand the kind of average citizen upon whom the catastrophe fell. It is therefore a great loss to history that even highly educated men have heard so little of him. For 100 men who have heard of Henry, for 50 who have heard of Cranmer, perhaps one could tell you who Stephen Gardiner was. Stephen Gardiner was born of that solid middle-class parentage which provided so many officials for the Tudor dynasty, especially those clerical officials who were its chief supports. We are not fixed on the date of his birth, but it came somewhere late-ish in the 1480s, so that he was a little older than King Henry and some 5 to 10 years younger than St. Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor. He went through the usual course of those middle-class lads who were destined for the church, a career which in those days led to the highest political position in men of temporal ability. He took his doctorate of law at Cambridge and then became Wolsey's secretary. He was a man of about 40 before he appeared in any very considerable political capacity, but by that time he was the regular Tudor civil servant of the day. He was a good ecclesiastic, but certainly at that time was putting his political office at least upon an equality with excuse me, lost my place. He was a man of about 40 before he appeared in any very considerable political capacity, but by that time he was the regular Tudor civil servant of the day. He was a good ecclesiastic, but certainly at that time was putting his political office at least upon an equality with, and probably above, his ecclesiastical. So far the man is simply one of a number of others, one of the regular Tudor officials' lot, rewarded with various ecclesiastical preferments by the king whom they served. He was a big, strong man, with a square-jawed, heavy face, enlivened, however, by quick, large, and brilliant dark eyes. He was fairly learned. He was very able controversialist. He was a good speaker, and a man full of health and energy. The divorce business broke out just when he was established in this important official career, and the government at once used him for their purpose. He had come from Wolsey's household. He had been, as I have said, Wolsey's secretary, and when Wolsey fell, he became secretary to Henry, which meant, of course, that all important official documents passed through his hands, and that his judgment was in most things taken and considered. Into the affair of the divorce he threw himself heartily, acting wholly and simply as the servant of his sovereign. Of the bullying to which the unfortunate Pope was subjected, the most extravagant and violent passages came from Gardiner himself. It was he, at Rome, who most directly threatened Clement with the danger of schism if he would not grant the divorce. He was wrapped up in the affair altogether without hesitation and without compromise, and the court regarded him as much their principal agent, and likely be their most successful one in this business, that he was given the great bishopric of Winchester as early as 1531, that is, long before the great business was decided, and while it was in full swing. The Bishop of Winchester in those days was one of the richest men in the kingdom. The office carried with it great political power as well. It had been the chief standby of Wolsey himself, and Gardiner, on obtaining it, became a very great man in English social and political life by mere rank, apart from what his talents and services had already proved him to be. But here we may note a curious point. When it came to the danger of schism, Gardiner had about him a touch of hesitation. It was only a touch, but it is significant of what was to come. He was still wholeheartedly in favor of that absolute kingly government and of that strong national feeling which went with it. He was still as much opposed as ever to the political papal claims over temporal sovereigns, and especially over his own sovereign, and when the decision had to be taken, he was ready to accept the supremacy of Henry over the Church in England, and even to defend it, as we shall see. I pointed out in the case of St. Thomas More that to be so far-sighted as to discern what the schism would ultimately mean was granted to very few. The average Englishman was with the king against the Pope in that particular quarrel, hoping vaguely perhaps that it would soon be patched up as so many others had been, but not connecting it in any way with doctrine. Therefore Gardiner, in every sense the average Englishman, followed the same road. Yet he did show a slight hesitation when the exact formula to which the king's supremacy should first be hinted at was introduced into the debates of the clergy. It should always be remembered in this connection that the royal supremacy was not, in the first steps towards it, represented as schismatical. The full schism was only arrived at by degrees, and after a series of steps, each of which, save the last, might be twisted or argued into orthodoxy. Some have said that this hesitation of Gardiner's, slight as it was, caused him to be passed over when Wareham died, and thus made him miss the primacy, the Archbishopric of Canterbury. But this is a false judgment. Not Gardiner, but Cranmer was marked out to be the next archbishop, because he was Anne Boleyn's man, her chaplain, and because he was crapulous and would do anything he was told, as the future was to show. Those who think that there was any chance for Gardiner misunderstand the position altogether, and particularly misunderstand the fact that it was Anne and not Henry who was running the whole affair. Anyhow, Stephen Gardiner remained very prominent, the great Bishop of Winchester, full of wealth and power. He accepted the supremacy, that is, more, a year after the full schism had appeared, that is, in 1535. He engaged his responsibility up to the hilt by writing a tract in favor of a schismatic policy, the famous tract De Vera Obediencia, concerning true obedience. There is a characteristic letter of this to Bucer, the continental reformer, in which he gives us an example of the excellence of the royal supremacy compared with the papal supremacy, on account of the better discipline it enforced throughout the Church in England. The king, he says, can strictly enforce the observation of celibacy, for instance, and can sharply correct the manners of his own clergy, while the Pope, under the circumstances of the time, where the Church has become so largely national, was lacking in effective power. In a word, Gardiner, in spite of that first half hesitation, was then, 1534, wholeheartedly for Henry's position, for the royal supremacy in things spiritual as well as temporal, and therefore, in practice, for the schism. And so he remained for years. He was a man of over 60 before he learned the lesson which all ultimately learned, that there can be no Catholicism without the Pope. To the modern mind, that, of course, is a truism. Indeed, today, with so many people outside the Church aping Catholicism, and so many more interesting themselves in this or that aspect of Catholicism, it is a matter of course that the ultimate test of Catholicism is the acceptation of the Pope's authority. But we must always remember, in reading of this period of the English Reformation, this main point, a neglect of which makes it incomprehensible. When the papal claims were debated, and had been debated for generations within the Catholic Church itself, before the breakup of Christendom in the great disaster of the 16th century. What with the political entanglements of temporal power, the Pope's political action as a mere Italian prince, the very large sums taken by the papacy in direct taxation from all countries, and the worldly character of too many popes of the day, some of them an open scandal, it needed the experience of disunion to prove the necessity of union, and to prove in especial that the test of unity was obedience to the See of Peter. When Bayard made his famous remark, "One can be a good Catholic without the Pope," he was saying what millions of men had said before consequences had taught them the contrary, and before the experience of what disunion would lead to had frightened them into full orthodoxy. Meanwhile, Stephen Gardiner, like Henry himself, was intensely Catholic in doctrine and practice, as opposed to the Lutheran, and still more as opposed to the Calvinist, and this endeared him to Henry, though Henry dreaded the strength and activity of his character. Gardiner always stood for the defense of the old national traditions in religion, of the Mass, of course, but also of the full doctrine of the real presence, and so down to the minor devotions of Catholic practice. When the violent discussions broke out among Henry's bishops, some of whom, led by Cranmer and under the protection of Cromwell, became more and more anti-Catholic in tone, Gardiner put all his weight into the scale to oppose the breakup. He was largely responsible for, and, perhaps, in part framed, the famous 6 Articles which during all the last years of Henry's reign enforced Catholic doctrine and practice under heavy penalties. On this account, it was that when Henry died in 1547, and that unscrupulous gang, first under Somerset and then under Northumberland, fell like harpies onto the remaining property of the church, and, to fill their pockets, thoroughly supported the religious revolutionaries, Gardiner was clearly a public danger to them, for he was the spokesman of what the mass of Englishmen felt. They imprisoned him, and they deprived him of his bishopric, and so he remained persecuted and a victim of the effort to impose a new religion by terror upon the English. He was naturally the hero of all that great bulk of the nation which detested the new revolutionary doctrines, and which rose in armed rebellion throughout the land against the newfangled Protestant service. Gardiner's name became the symbol of the older and better state of things, and return of which men so ardently desired. We shall see how, when the diseased little Edward was dead, Mary took Gardiner out of the Tower and raised him to the highest political position in England, making him her chancellor. That is much more even than what he should call today Prime Minister, and Gardiner now bore witness to the fullness of his faith. There was no process of recantation, still any trace of political motive. That which he had never thought possible, the presence of an anti-Catholic government in England, the destruction of the Mass, the unscrupulous despoiling of guild property, the oversetting of all shrines, the wanton destruction of churches, had proved to him what the fruits of disunion might be. But for the schism, which he had approved, such things could not have come to pass, and now he was determined to undo the schism, and worked with all his might for the restoration of England to the unity of Christendom, which he had the great privilege to see accomplished before he died. And he gave the famous cry, Negavi cum Petro, exivi cum Petro, sed non flevi cum Petro. I denied as Peter did, I went out as Peter did, but I have not wept as Peter did. He was unfortunate indeed to live such a moment, and fortunate, I think, also in dying before he could see all the good work swept away. For he passed on the 12th of November, 1555, overshadowed indeed by some dread of the future, but not witnessing the breakdown which followed 3 years later on Mary's death. What overshadowed him was his fear of the results of the Spanish marriage. He had been again typically English in his stout resistance to that policy. It was he who had urged upon the Queen the advisability of marrying one of her English nobles, and if Courtenay had had a better character, he would have carried his point. The opposition to Mary's Spanish marriage put him in a minority in the council, and he had to give way. Indeed, the marriage with Philip was solemnized in his own cathedral and by Gardiner himself. There is one last point to be made with regard to him, and that is his attitude toward the persecutions of the revolutionaries for heresy rather than for treason. Because he was chancellor, because he was Mary's right-hand man, and the most prominent of the Catholic protagonists, the symbol of tradition and the national religion, he was until recently almost universally accused by our official historians of particular harshness and even cruelty in the treatment of the heretics after the new policy began. Now, what was his real attitude towards it? We have no need for reluctance in that matter. The government had a perfect right to treat a small rebel minority, which was working for the destruction of religion and of the monarch as well, as public enemies. It was rather a matter of policy than of morals, whether the rebels should be treated as heretics or as traitors. But was Gardiner, as a fact, prominent in the prosecutions? Was he a leading spirit in them? It may be doubted or even denied. As Chancellor, it was of course his business to preside over the affair, but it is to be remarked that he took pains to save men from the consequences of their error, that he personally helped some of the most in danger to escape from the country, and in his own great diocese there were no executions. That was due in part, of course, to the fact that the poison had not reached the western country parts over which that diocese extended. It was only virulent in London, one or two seaport towns, and certain sections of East Anglia and the home counties. But still, from all that we know of the nature of the man and of his policy and other things, we may fairly conclude that if he had had a free hand, he would have been in favor of Philip of Spain's policy, and not that of the council. He would, I think, had he had a free hand, have made a few examples by prosecuting for treason, but he would have prevented the wholesale prosecutions for heresy, for that was what Mary's Spanish husband had urged, to repress treason rather than heresy. But Paget and the council, to show their English independence, rejected the foreigners' counsel. Such, I say, should be, I think, our general conclusion. But we must not run to the extreme of saying that he was an overt opponent to the policy of prosecuting and executing for heresy. He certainly was not that. When it was once undertaken, he carried it out, and nothing by way of public pronouncements fell from him to show that he objected. He did not, for instance, openly oppose it, as he had openly opposed the Spanish marriage. Such was Stephen Gardiner, a character, then most national, which more than any other helps us to grasp, when we are fully acquainted with it, the character of the time in which he lived, and especially the attitude of the normal Englishman in those difficult and confused days. There was no one to succeed him. There was no other typical national figure to symbolize the reluctance and the distaste everywhere profoundly felt for the new and fanatical movement against the ancient national traditions of England. Had there been one of similar authority and with as great a past, in the first years of Elizabeth's reign, Cecil would perhaps not have undertaken with the same success the evil work he did.